The morning of October 24, 1944, began with routine combat air patrol launches from the USS Essex. Lieutenant Commander David McCampbell stood on the carrier's flight deck, watching mechanics fuel his Grumman F6F Hellcat, while intelligence officers rushed updated enemy position reports to ready rooms throughout the ship. The Philippine Sea stretched endlessly in all directions, deceptively calm under overcast skies that would soon witness one of the most one-sided aerial slaughters in naval warfare history. McCampbell didn't know it yet, but the Japanese Navy was committing everything it had left to one final, desperate gamble. 3 separate task forces, comprising virtually every operational warship Japan could muster, were converging on Leyte Gulf, where American invasion forces had been landing troops for 2 days. Admiral Takeo Kurita's center force alone included the super battleships Yamato and Musashi, 5 other battleships, 12 cruisers, and 15 destroyers. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa's northern force brought 4 aircraft carriers as decoys. Admiral Shoji Nishimura's southern force added 2 battleships and 4 destroyers to the equation. The Japanese plan was intricate, almost elegant in its desperation. Ozawa's carriers, nearly empty of aircraft after months of devastating losses, would lure Admiral William Halsey's powerful Third Fleet north, away from the invasion beaches. While Halsey chased the decoy carriers, Kurita and Nishimura would converge on Leyte Gulf from different directions, smash through the light escort carriers and destroyers protecting the invasion force, and slaughter the vulnerable transports. If executed perfectly, the plan might delay the American advance by months, perhaps force negotiations. Japan's admirals knew they couldn't win the war, but they believed they might avoid unconditional surrender if they inflicted enough pain. What the Japanese didn't fully comprehend was how completely American carrier aviation had evolved since the dark days of 1942. The Grumman F6F Hellcat wasn't just another fighter aircraft. It represented a systematic engineering response to every lesson learned in blood over 3 years of Pacific combat. Where the legendary Mitsubishi Zero achieved agility through lightweight construction and minimal protection, the Hellcat was built like a flying fortress, with heavy armor plating behind the pilot, self-sealing fuel tanks that prevented fires, and armored glass that could stop machine gun rounds. The Zero could outturn any American fighter, but in a Hellcat, you didn't need to turn with the enemy. You dove from altitude, fired your 650 caliber machine guns with devastating effect, then used your superior speed to climb back up before the Zero could respond. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The Hellcat's Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine produced 2,000 horsepower, giving the aircraft a top speed of 380 miles per hour at 23,000 feet. The Zero, by comparison, maxed out at 350 miles per hour. That 30-mile-per-hour difference meant Hellcat pilots could dictate engagement terms. They chose when to fight and when to disengage. More importantly, the Hellcat mounted 6 Browning M 250 caliber heavy machine guns, 3 in each wing, with 400 rounds per gun. When all 6 guns fired simultaneously, they produced a stream of half-inch diameter projectiles that could soar through aluminum airframes, shatter engines, and disintegrate control surfaces. The Zero typically carried 2 20mm cannons with limited ammunition and 2 smaller caliber machine guns. The Hellcat's volume of fire was simply overwhelming. By October 1944, American carrier task forces operated with brutal efficiency. Each Essex-class carrier, like the USS Essex, could launch and recover aircraft continuously, maintaining combat air patrols overhead while simultaneously striking enemy targets hundreds of miles away. The carriers operated in task groups, multiple carriers supported by battleships, cruisers, and destroyers, all coordinated through sophisticated radio communications and radar tracking. The Japanese had pioneered carrier aviation doctrine in the 1930s, but by late 1944, they'd been overtaken completely. American carriers were faster, carried more aircraft, and operated with better damage control procedures. More critically, American pilot training had remained rigorous throughout the war. New pilots arrived at their carriers with over 300 hours of flight time, including extensive gunnery practice and tactical training. Japanese pilot training had collapsed under the strain of war. By October 1944, new Japanese pilots were being sent into combat with as little as 100 hours of flight time, barely enough to master takeoffs and landings, let alone combat tactics. The qualitative gap between American and Japanese naval aviation had become a chasm. Admiral Mark Mitcher commanded Task Force 38, the fast carrier component of Halsey's Third Fleet. Mitcher was a pioneer of carrier aviation, having commanded the USS Hornet when it launched Doolittle's raid on Tokyo in April 1942. By October 1944, he commanded 4 task groups built around 16 fleet and light carriers, carrying over 1,000 aircraft. This was a weapon of unimaginable power, capable of projecting American air power across hundreds of miles of ocean, striking targets with precision and overwhelming force. The Essex's Air Group 15, commanded by David McCampbell, was one of the most effective air groups in the Pacific Fleet. McCampbell had already established himself as the Navy's leading ace with 21 confirmed kills before October 24. His pilots trusted him completely because he'd proven his tactical judgment repeatedly. He taught them to be aggressive but disciplined, to close to ranges where their guns couldn't miss, to manage their ammunition carefully, and to work as coordinated teams rather than individual hunters. Air Group 15's fighter squadron, VF-15, was equipped entirely with Hellcats. The dive bomber squadron flew Curtiss SB-2C Helldivers. The torpedo squadron operated Grumman TBF Avengers. Together, these 3 squadrons could deliver bombs, torpedoes, and rockets against surface targets, while the fighters swept enemy aircraft from the sky. The Japanese strike force approaching the American carriers on the morning of October 24 consisted of approximately 60 aircraft, a mixture of Zero fighters, Nakajima B 6N torpedo bombers, and Yokosuka D-4Y dive bombers. These aircraft had launched from Japanese airfields on Luzon, part of a coordinated effort to strike American carriers before they could interfere with Admiral Kurita's center force, which was then transiting the Sibuyan Sea. The Japanese pilots knew they faced overwhelming odds, but they flew anyway because their culture demanded it and because they still believed, despite mounting evidence to the contrary, that Japanese fighting spirit could overcome American material superiority. The American radar operators aboard the Essex detected the incoming Japanese formation at approximately 08:20 hours, when the enemy was still 80 miles away. The ship's loudspeakers crackled with the urgent call, "Pilots, man your planes!" Within minutes, available fighter pilots were sprinting to the flight deck, pulling on flight gear as they ran. Standard pre-flight procedures were abbreviated to bare essentials. The threat was immediate, and every fighter needed to get airborne before the Japanese strike arrived overhead. McCampbell reached, his Hellcat, marked with the number 13 and nicknamed Mincy III, after his wife Mildred. His crew chief delivered bad news. Due to the rushed launch schedule, McCampbell's aircraft had only been partially fueled. He had roughly 300 gallons instead of the standard 550 gallons. Quick mental calculation told him he'd have perhaps 2 hours of flight time at cruise settings, far less if he engaged in combat maneuvering at full throttle. Most commanders would have waited for proper fueling, but waiting meant the Japanese bombers might reach the carriers unopposed. McCampbell made his decision instantly. He'd launch with whatever fuel he had and make it work. His wingman, Lieutenant Roy Rushing, faced the identical situation. The 24-year-old pilot from Tennessee didn't hesitate either. Rushing had been flying as McCampbell's wingman for months, and they'd developed the kind of unspoken communication that only comes from repeated combat together. A good wingman doesn't just follow. He anticipates threats, protects the leader's blind spots, and coordinates attacks without needing detailed instructions. Rushing was exceptional at this role, with several confirmed kills already to his credit and gunnery skills nearly as precise as McCampbell's. 7 Hellcats launched in sequence, catapults flinging each fighter off the deck in controlled explosions of steam and hydraulic power. Once airborne, they formed up loosely and climbed toward the intercept coordinates provided by the Essex's fighter direction officer. The radio chatter was tense but professional. Other American fighters from different carriers were also scrambling, but coordination between ships was minimal. Each carrier group was essentially managing its own defense against an enemy force that outnumbered the available defenders by substantial margins. McCampbell's flight reached 25,000 feet and leveled off, scanning the horizon for the enemy formation. At that altitude, the air was thin and cold. The Hellcat's engine hummed with a steady, reassuring rhythm. McCampbell checked his instruments methodically. Oil pressure normal, engine temperature within limits, ammunition counters showing full loads. He had 2,400 rounds across his 6 guns. If he maintained fire discipline with short, precise bursts, that ammunition could account for dozens of firing opportunities. The key was not to waste rounds spraying wildly, but to fire only when the geometry was perfect and hits were certain. Then he saw them. The Japanese formation appeared as dark specks against blue sky, growing rapidly larger as the two forces converged at a combined closing speed of over 400 miles per hour. McCampbell counted quickly. At least 60 aircraft, possibly more. They were flying in relatively loose formation with 0 fighters positioned above and around the slower bombers. The bombers were a mixture of torpedo bombers carrying aerial, torpedoes and dive bombers loaded with armor-piercing bombs, each aircraft carrying ordnance specifically designed to sink American carriers. The 5 other Hellcats in McCampbell's flight peeled off to engage different parts of the formation, following their briefed tactics. That left McCampbell and Rushing alone, 2 fighters facing 60. The mathematics were brutal, but McCampbell possessed advantages the Japanese didn't fully appreciate. His Hellcat was faster, more durable, and packed heavier firepower than anything the enemy flew. More importantly, McCampbell had refined his tactical approach through 21 previous victories. He understood how to use altitude and speed to dictate engagement terms, how to identify the most valuable targets in a formation, and how to destroy enemy aircraft with minimal ammunition expenditure. He keyed his radio and spoke calmly to Rushing. "Stay with me. We'll hit the bombers first." The tactical logic was sound. Bombers represented the actual threat to American carriers. Destroying them eliminated the danger regardless of how many escort fighters survived. McCampbell positioned his Hellcat above and behind the Japanese formation, using altitude advantage to set up his first attack run. The Japanese hadn't spotted the 2 American fighters yet, their attention focused forward and on maintaining formation discipline. McCampbell checked his gun sight one final time. The illuminated reticle glowed amber in the center of his windscreen. He flipped the master armament switch to armed, feeling the slight electrical hum as the gun charging system activated. His heart rate was steady, breathing controlled. Years of training and months of combat had prepared him for exactly this moment. He rolled his Hellcat inverted, pulled back on the stick, and dove toward the Japanese formation with Rushing following close behind, beginning an engagement that would demonstrate the complete supremacy of American carrier aviation and prove that Japan's desperate gamble at Leyte Gulf was already lost before the surface fleets even made contact. McCampbell's Hellcat accelerated through the dive, the airframe shuddering slightly as airspeed climbed past 350 miles per hour. The Japanese formation grew rapidly in his windscreen, individual aircraft resolving from distant specks into recognizable silhouettes. He'd trained himself to identify Japanese aircraft types instantly, a survival skill that meant the difference between targeting high-value bombers versus engaging nimble fighters. The formation below consisted primarily of Nakajima B-6N torpedo bombers, designated JIL by American intelligence, mixed with several Yokosuka D-4Y dive bombers called Judy. Both types were single-engine aircraft with 2 or 3 crew members, significantly slower than fighters and vulnerable once separated from their Zero escorts. The Zero fighters positioned as escorts were scanning the wrong altitude band. Japanese tactical doctrine still emphasized horizontal combat, with fighters maintaining relatively close proximity to the bombers they protected. McCampbell's approach from high altitude exploited a fundamental weakness in this defensive arrangement. By the time the Zero pilots spotted the diving Hellcats, McCampbell would already be firing at their bombers, and the Zeros would need precious seconds to react, reposition, and pursue. McCampbell selected his first target with clinical precision. A Nakajima B-6N flew near the formation's edge, slightly separated from the main group by perhaps 200 feet. The aircraft carried a Type 91 aerial torpedo slung beneath its fuselage, a weapon designed to drop from low altitude, enter the water without breaking apart, then run toward its target at 40 knots. If that torpedo reached an American carrier, it could blast a hole 20 feet across in the ship's hull below the waterline, potentially sinking or crippling a vessel worth tens of millions of dollars and carrying 3,000 crew members. McCampbell intended to ensure that the torpedo never threatened anything. He lined up the shot with practiced ease, the illuminated gun sight reticle tracking smoothly across the bomber's profile as he compensated for the relative motion between diving fighter and level-flying target. The geometry required a split-second calculation. He needed to fire ahead of the target, putting his bullets where the enemy aircraft would be a fraction of a second later, not where it was now. Too much lead and the rounds would pass harmlessly in front. Too little, and they'd trail behind. McCampbell had made this calculation hundreds of times in training and dozens of times in actual combat. His hands moved with unconscious precision, adjusting the stick and rudder to establish the perfect firing solution. At 400 yards range, he pressed the trigger mounted on his control stick. The Hellcat's 6 50-caliber machine guns erupted. Simultaneously, their combined recoil vibrating through the entire airframe. The Browning M2 was arguably the finest heavy machine gun ever designed, capable of firing 850 rounds per minute per gun with devastating accuracy. When 6 of them fired together, they produced a combined rate of over 5,000 rounds per minute, though McCampbell fired in controlled 2-second bursts that released approximately 100 to 60 rounds total. He didn't need sustained fire. He needed precision. The stream of half-inch diameter projectiles arced through the air in a flat trajectory. The tracer rounds mixed into the ammunition belt, marking the path with bright streaks. McCampbell watched his rounds converge on the Nakajima bomber's right-wing route, precisely where the wing joined the fuselage. This was a critical structural point, and also where Japanese aircraft designers typically located fuel tanks. The B-6N's tanks weren't self-sealing like American designs. When punctured, they leaked fuel that atomized in the airstream and ignited from any spark or hot metal fragment. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. McCampbell's bullets shredded the bomber's wing structure, several rounds punching through aluminum skin and sparking against internal framework. Fuel vapor ignited in a bright orange fireball that consumed the entire right-wing section within seconds. The bomber rolled violently to the right as the burning wing lost lift, its torpedo still attached to the fuselage. McCampbell pulled his Hellcat's nose up sharply, climbing back toward altitude as the doomed B-6N spiraled downward, trailing fire and smoke. He didn't watch it hit the water. He was already scanning for his next target. The entire attack run had taken perhaps 8 seconds from the moment McCampbell opened fire until he climbed away. Rushing, following McCampbell's dive exactly as briefed, selected a different bomber in the formation and executed an identical attack. His gunnery was nearly as precise as his commander's. Another Nakajima B-6N staggered under the impact of concentrated 50-caliber fire, its left engine erupting in flames. The pilot tried to maintain control, but fire spread rapidly through the engine nacelle and into the cockpit area. Within 15 seconds, that bomber was also falling toward the ocean, leaving a trail of black smoke that marked its descent. 2 aircraft destroyed in less than 20 seconds. The Japanese formation reacted with predictable confusion. The bomber pilots, already nervous about their mission's chances, saw aircraft exploding around them and instinctively broke formation, each pilot turning away from the perceived threat. This was exactly what McCampbell wanted. A tight formation could concentrate defensive fire and make coordinated evasive maneuvers. A scattered formation was simply a collection of individual targets, each one isolated and vulnerable. The Zero escorts finally recognized the threat and attempted to pursue the two Hellcats, but McCampbell had already climbed back above them, using his superior speed and the energy gained from his dive to regain altitude advantage. The Zeros, slower in level flight and especially slow in climbs, couldn't follow. They were designed for turning combat at medium altitudes, not for the vertical fighting tactics that American pilots had perfected. Some Japanese pilots tried anyway, pulling their aircraft's noses up in steep climbs that bled airspeed rapidly. Within seconds, their Zeros were wallowing in the thin air, barely maintaining flying speed, while McCampbell and Rushing circled overhead, completely unthreatened. McCampbell keyed his radio, setting up for another run. Same tactic. Rushing acknowledged with a brief, "Roger," and the two Hellcats positioned themselves for their second attack. The Japanese bombers were now scattered across several square miles of sky, some attempting to reform, while others simply fled toward their original target, hoping to deliver their weapons before being shot down. The Zero fighters were equally disorganized, some chasing the Americans fruitlessly while others stayed with the bombers, trying to provide at least token protection. McCampbell selected another target, a Yokosuka D-4Y dive bomber flying alone about 1,000 feet below his position. The D-4Y was faster than the torpedo bombers, capable of nearly 360 miles per hour in level flight, but it was still significantly slower than the Hellcat and far more fragile. The aircraft carried a single bomb, probably a 500-kilogram armor-piercing weapon designed to penetrate a carrier's flight deck before detonating deep inside the ship. McCampbell rolled into another diving attack, the familiar G-forces pressing him into his seat as the Hellcat accelerated downward. This time he approached from a slight angle rather than directly astern, giving him a better view of the target and making it harder for the D-4Y's rear gunner to return effective fire. Japanese rear gunners typically operated a single 7.7mm machine gun on a flexible mount, a weapon with neither the range nor the hitting power to seriously threaten an attacking Hellcat unless the gunner was exceptionally skilled and lucky. McCampbell had faced rear gunners dozens of times. Their tracer fire looked threatening but rarely connected, and even when it did, the Hellcat's armor usually prevented serious damage. He opened fire at 350 yards, a slightly longer range than his first attack, but still well within his gun's effective envelope. The convergence point where all 6 gun barrels pointed was set at 300 yards, meaning at that exact distance, all 6 streams of fire crossed at a single point. McCampbell aimed for the D-4Y's fuselage just behind the cockpit, where the aircraft's internal structure was weakest and where fuel tanks were located. His first burst lasted perhaps 1.5 seconds, sending roughly 120 rounds toward the target. The results were spectacular. Multiple rounds struck the dive bomber's fuselage, several penetrating the thin aluminum skin and detonating the aircraft's internal fuel supply. The D-4Y didn't gradually burn like the first bomber McCampbell had destroyed. Instead, it exploded in a massive fireball as fuel vapor ignited all at once, the blast wave visible as a spherical shockwave that expanded and dissipated in seconds. Debris scattered across the sky, the largest intact piece being the D-4Y's tail section, which tumbled end over end as it fell. The pilot and gunner had no chance to bail out. They were simply erased in an instant. 3 confirmed kills in less than 2 minutes of combat. McCampbell pulled up again, scanning his instruments quickly. Fuel gauge showed he'd burned through about a quarter of his limited supply already, the high-throttle combat maneuvering consuming gasoline at alarming rates. He made a quick mental calculation. He probably had another hour of combat time at most, perhaps less if he continued aggressive diving attacks. He decided to continue anyway. The threat to the American carriers was immediate, and every Japanese bomber he destroyed now was one less weapon threatening his shipmates. Rushing scored his 3rd kill moments later, sending another torpedo bomber into the sea with a precisely aimed burst that severed the aircraft's tail section. The 2 Americans had now destroyed 6 Japanese aircraft between them, roughly 10% of the entire enemy formation, and the engagement had barely begun. Other American fighters from different carriers were also tearing into the scattered Japanese formation. McCampbell could see distant dogfights developing across the sky, tiny aircraft maneuvering against each other miles away. Too far to identify who was winning, but close enough to know the battle was spreading across dozens of miles of airspace. The Japanese formation was disintegrating. Some bombers were trying to press forward toward the American carriers, hoping to deliver their weapons despite mounting losses. Others were turning back toward Luzon, abandoning their mission in hopes of survival. The Zero escorts were caught in an impossible dilemma. They could stay with the bombers and be slaughtered by diving Hellcats they couldn't catch, or they could pursue the American fighters and leave the bombers completely unprotected. Most chose to stay with the bombers, accepting their likely deaths as the price of duty. McCampbell set up his fourth attack, targeting another Nakajima B-6N that was attempting to escape at low altitude. The torpedo bomber was flying barely 200 feet above the ocean surface, the pilot hoping that staying low would make him harder to spot and attack. This was actually sound tactical thinking. Diving attacks from altitude became much riskier at low elevation because the attacking fighter had less room to pull out before hitting the water. But McCampbell had trained extensively in low-altitude combat. He understood the geometry and knew his aircraft's capabilities intimately. He descended to about 1,500 feet and approached the fleeing bomber from directly astern, matching the target's altitude instead of diving. This was a different type of attack, requiring patience rather than speed. The B-6N's rear gunner opened fire as McCampbell closed the range, tracer rounds arcing past the Hellcat's cockpit in graceful but ineffective streams. McCampbell ignored the defensive fire and focused on his gun sight, waiting for the range to close to point-blank distance where missing would be nearly impossible. At 200 yards, he fired a 3-second burst, nearly 240 rounds. The extended burst was necessary because his angle of attack was less optimal than his previous diving runs. The 50 caliber rounds walked up the bomber's fuselage from tail to cockpit, shredding control surfaces, puncturing fuel tanks, and killing the crew. The B-6N's engine continued running for a few seconds after McCampbell ceased fire, but the aircraft was already dead, its controls severed, and its pilot slumped in his harness. It descended gradually into the ocean, hitting the water at a shallow angle and disintegrating on impact, the torpedo breaking free and sinking unfired. Rushing destroyed another D-4Y moments later, using the same low-altitude stern approach that McCampbell had just demonstrated. The two Americans were operating with extraordinary efficiency now, each attack flowing seamlessly into the next, their tactical coordination requiring almost no radio communication. They'd developed an intuitive understanding of each other's intentions through months of flying together, each pilot anticipating the other's moves and positioning accordingly. McCampbell glanced at his fuel gauge again. He was now below half tanks, with perhaps 45 minutes of flight time remaining. His ammunition counters showed he'd expended roughly 600 rounds, leaving 1,800 rounds still available. The mathematics were favorable. At his current rate of expenditure, he had enough ammunition to engage another 15 to 20 targets if opportunities presented themselves. The limiting factor would be fuel, not firepower. The Japanese formation had been reduced to scattered individuals and small groups, most fleeing toward Luzon, while a few determined crews still pressed toward the American carriers. McCampbell counted quickly, trying to estimate how many enemy aircraft remained airborne. Perhaps 40, maybe fewer. The American fighters had inflicted devastating losses in less than 15 minutes of combat, validating every tactical doctrine that had been developed through 3 years of Pacific warfare. He spotted another target, a lone Zero fighter circling protectively near 2 damaged bombers that were struggling to maintain altitude. The Zero pilot was either exceptionally brave or exceptionally foolish to remain in the area. McCampbell decided to engage the fighter first, eliminating the escort before finishing the bombers. Fighting a Zero required different tactics than attacking bombers. The Zero could turn, could maneuver, could fight back with cannon fire that was genuinely dangerous if it connected. McCampbell approached carefully, using altitude advantage to observe the Zero's movements before committing to an attack. The Japanese pilot spotted the Hellcat and immediately broke hard left, pulling his aircraft into a tight turn that the more heavily built American fighter couldn't match. This was classic Zero tactics, using superior turning ability to get inside an opponent's turn radius and reverse the attack. Against a pilot who tried to turn with the Zero, this tactic was devastatingly effective. Against McCampbell, it was suicide. Instead of turning to follow, McCampbell simply extended his dive, using gravity and his Hellcat's superior speed to open the distance. The Zero pilot completed his turn and found himself looking at empty sky. McCampbell had disappeared, but not by retreating. He'd traded altitude for speed, diving below the Zero's position, then using that speed to climb back up behind the Japanese fighter from a different angle. The entire maneuver took perhaps 20 seconds and left McCampbell positioned perfectly for a stern attack while the confused Zero pilot was still searching for his opponent. McCampbell fired from 300 yards, a 2-second burst that sent 160 rounds toward the Zero's vulnerable tail section. Unlike bombers, fighters were smaller targets requiring more precision, but McCampbell's gunnery was equal to the challenge. His rounds converged on the Zero's fuselage just ahead of the tail, several bullets striking the aircraft's main fuel tank. The Zero erupted in flames, the lightweight construction that gave it such remarkable agility, also making it extraordinarily vulnerable when hit. The pilot attempted to bail out, but the fire spread too quickly. McCampbell saw the cockpit canopy slide back, then the flames engulfed the entire forward fuselage. The Zero rolled inverted and fell, another victory in what was becoming the most lopsided aerial engagement of the entire Pacific campaign. The two damaged bombers the Zero had been protecting were now completely defenseless. McCampbell and Rushing destroyed them both in quick succession, Rushing taking the lead bomber while McCampbell engaged the second. Both attacks were textbook examples of fighter gunnery, short bursts at optimal range producing immediate catastrophic damage. Within 30 seconds, both bombers were falling toward the ocean, leaving only debris and oil slicks to mark where they'd been. McCampbell's kill count for this single engagement now stood at 7 confirmed. Rushing had destroyed 5. Together, they'd eliminated 12 Japanese aircraft, roughly 20% of the original formation, and the battle was continuing. Other American fighters were still engaged across the massive aerial battlefield, each engagement adding to the mounting Japanese losses. The raid that was supposed to cripple American carrier operations was instead becoming a massacre, a demonstration of American air superiority so complete that Japanese admirals monitoring the battle from their flagship had to be wondering if anything could stop the American advance. The fuel situation was becoming critical. McCampbell checked his gauge and saw he had perhaps 20 minutes of flight time remaining, maybe slightly more if he throttled back and flew economically. He radioed Rushing. "We need to start thinking about recovery. Fuel state is critical." Rushing acknowledged his own fuel situation was equally precarious. But before they could disengage, McCampbell spotted another cluster of Japanese aircraft ahead, perhaps a dozen bombers with a few escorts, still pressing toward the American carriers with stubborn determination. He made his decision immediately. "One more pass, then we break off." The mathematics of risk versus reward favored engagement. Each bomber destroyed now eliminated a direct threat to his carrier, to his shipmates, to the entire invasion operation. His personal safety was secondary to that mission requirement. This wasn't reckless bravado. It was calculated tactical judgment based on clear understanding of priorities. McCampbell positioned for what he intended to be his final attack of this engagement, knowing that in 72 hours, this single morning's combat would be merely the opening act of the largest naval battle in human history, and that the tactical lessons being written in fire and blood above the Philippine Sea would determine not just the outcome of this battle, but the entire trajectory of the Pacific War's final year. McCampbell's final attack run against the remaining Japanese bomber formation required every skill he'd accumulated through years of combat flying. His fuel gauge needle hovered dangerously close to the reserve marker, that red line indicating the absolute minimum needed to return to the Essex and execute a safe landing. He had perhaps 15 minutes of flight time remaining, maybe less depending on how aggressively he maneuvered. The cluster of Japanese bombers ahead represented one last opportunity to inflict damage before fuel constraints forced disengagement. He selected his approach vector carefully, positioning his Hellcat to attack from the bomber's port side rather than from directly astern. This angle gave him a better deflection shot and reduced exposure to defensive fire from rear gunners. The geometry was more complex than a simple stern chase, requiring him to lead the target more aggressively and adjust for the relative motion between his diving fighter and the level-flying bombers. But McCampbell had made these calculations so many times they'd become instinctive, his hands adjusting stick and rudder without conscious thought. The target was another Nakajima B-6N, flying in loose formation with three others. McCampbell opened fire at 320 yards, slightly longer range than ideal, but necessary given his approach angle. His 2-second burst sent approximately 160 rounds toward the bomber's port wing and engine nacelle. Multiple rounds connected, the 50 caliber bullets punching through aluminum skin and into the radial engine's complex machinery. The engine seized almost immediately, propeller blades freezing in place as internal components shattered. Without power, the B-6N rolled left and descended toward the ocean, controllable but doomed. Rushing engaged simultaneously, targeting a different bomber in the formation with equally devastating results. His burst ignited fuel tanks in the target's starboard wing, flames spreading rapidly across the entire wing surface. The Japanese pilot attempted to maintain control, but the fire was consuming critical flight surfaces. Within 20 seconds, the bomber's wing structure failed completely, the burning wing separating from the fuselage in a catastrophic structural failure. The fuselage tumbled end over end as it fell, spinning like a child's toy dropped from height. The remaining Japanese bombers in the formation scattered immediately, each pilot making individual decisions about whether to continue toward the American carriers or abandon the mission entirely. Most chose survival over duty, turning back toward Luzon with their weapons still attached. A few continued forward with fatalistic determination, knowing they faced almost certain death but unwilling to return without at least attempting to strike the enemy. McCampbell climbed away from the engagement area, calling Rushing to form up on his wing. "That's it? We're heading home." His fuel gauge showed perhaps 12 minutes remaining, enough to reach the Essex if he flew efficiently and didn't encounter any complications. Combat had consumed fuel at rates far exceeding normal cruise settings, the high throttle positions and violent maneuvering burning through gasoline that would have lasted hours in peacetime conditions. The flight back to the carrier gave McCampbell time to assess the engagement's results. He'd personally destroyed 9 Japanese aircraft in approximately 90 minutes of combat. Rushing had destroyed 6. 15 aircraft total from a 2-plane section, an almost incomprehensible level of effectiveness. The broader engagement had been equally successful. Radio chatter indicated other American fighter sections had inflicted similar devastation on the scattered Japanese formation. Initial estimates suggested the raid had lost over 40 aircraft before reaching their targets, with only a handful of bombers actually getting close enough to attack American carriers, and those attacks were largely ineffective. The Essex appeared on the horizon, exactly where McCampbell's navigation had predicted. The carrier was steaming into the wind, flight deck ready to recover returning aircraft. McCampbell entered the landing pattern behind several other Hellcats, each fighter circling the carrier at decreasing altitudes while waiting for their turn to land. The recovery process was highly choreographed, each aircraft approaching the carrier from astern, descending to just above the water, then climbing slightly as it crossed the stern to catch an arresting wire with its tail hook. McCampbell's landing was routine, a brief moment of controlled violence as his Hellcat slammed onto the wooden flight deck at 90 miles per hour, tail hook catching the number 3 wire and bringing the aircraft to a complete stop in less than 300 feet. Deck crew swarmed the Hellcat immediately, detaching the arresting wire and pushing the aircraft forward to clear the landing area for the next fighter. McCampbell shut down the engine, the sudden silence after hours of continuous engine noise creating a moment of disorientation. He climbed out of the cockpit, feeling physically and mentally exhausted. High-altitude combat was intensely demanding, requiring constant vigilance, split-second decisions, and precise motor control under conditions of extreme stress. The adrenaline that had sustained him through 90 minutes of combat was draining away, leaving fatigue in its wake. But there was also satisfaction. He'd accomplished exactly what was required, destroyed multiple threats to his ship, and returned safely with his wingman. It was, by any measure, an extraordinarily successful mission. The intelligence officers debriefed McCampbell and Rushing immediately, recording every detail of the engagement while memories were fresh. They wanted to know numbers, aircraft types, observed damage, enemy tactics, everything that might be useful for analyzing the engagement and planning future operations. McCampbell described each attack methodically, estimating ranges, burst durations, and observed results. The intelligence officers seemed almost disbelieving at first. 9 confirmed kills in a single mission was exceptional even by the aggressive standards of late 1944. But Rushing corroborated every claim, and gun camera footage, when developed, would provide visual confirmation. What neither McCampbell nor anyone else aboard the Essex fully understood yet was that this morning's engagement was merely the opening phase of a 4-day battle that would completely destroy Japanese naval power in the Pacific. Admiral Kurita's center force was even then being hammered by wave after wave of American carrier aircraft as it transited the Sibuyan Sea. The super battleship Musashi, once considered unsinkable, was absorbing torpedo and bomb hits with each successive strike. By late afternoon, Musashi would capsize and sink, taking over 1,000 crew members to the bottom. Kurita would temporarily withdraw, shaken by the ferocity of American air attacks. Admiral Ozawa's decoy force succeeded in luring Admiral Halsey north, exactly as the Japanese plan intended. But success was temporary. When Halsey's carriers finally located and engaged Ozawa's fleet on October 25th, American aircraft would sink all 4 Japanese carriers in a matter of hours. These weren't even difficult victories. The Japanese carriers had almost no aircraft remaining to defend themselves, their decks nearly empty after months of catastrophic losses. American dive bombers and torpedo bombers attacked with impunity, scoring hits almost at will. The carriers Zuikaku, Zuiho, Chitose, and Chiyoda all sank, ending Japanese carrier aviation as an effective force. But perhaps the most dramatic action occurred off Samar Island on the morning of October 25th, when Admiral Kurita's center force, having reversed course and pushed through the San Bernardino Strait during the night, unexpectedly, encountered a group of American escort carriers and destroyers. The escort carriers were small, slow ships designed to provide air support for ground troops, not to fight battleships. Their destroyers were outnumbered and outgunned by Kurita's battleships and cruisers. By any rational calculation, the American ships should have been annihilated within an hour. Instead, what followed was one of the most remarkable actions in naval history. The American destroyers charged directly at the Japanese battleships, firing torpedoes and guns against opponents that could destroy them with single salvos. The escort carriers launched every aircraft they had, including unarmed planes, loaded only with depth charges meant for anti-submarine warfare. These aircraft attacked the Japanese fleet anyway, the pilots dropping depth charges on battleships in desperation, strafing with machine guns, even making dry runs without any weapons at all, simply to distract Japanese gunners and buy time for the carriers to escape. The American resistance was so fierce, so unexpectedly aggressive, that Admiral Kurita became convinced he was facing fleet carriers and heavy cruisers rather than the escort carriers and destroyers he was actually fighting. After sinking 2 escort carriers and 3 destroyers, Kurita withdrew, believing he'd stumbled into a trap and that Halsey's fleet carriers were approaching. In reality, Halsey was hundreds of miles north, engaged with Ozawa's decoys. Kurita had been on the verge of reaching the vulnerable American transports in Leyte Gulf when he turned away, ending Japan's last realistic chance to disrupt the invasion. The Battle of Leyte Gulf concluded on October 26th with Japanese naval power effectively destroyed. Japan had committed 3 separate fleets, totaling 64 major warships to the operation. They lost 4 aircraft carriers, 3 battleships, 10 cruisers, and 11 destroyers. Over 12,000 Japanese sailors died. American losses were significant but bearable. 1 light carrier, 2 escort carriers, 2 destroyers, and 1 destroyer escort. Perhaps 3,000 American sailors were killed. But the air combat statistics revealed the true extent of Japanese defeat. Over the 4 days of battle, American carrier aircraft flew thousands of sorties against Japanese ships and aircraft. Japanese losses exceeded 600 aircraft, counting both carrier-based planes and land-based aircraft flying from Philippine airfields. American aircraft losses totaled approximately 100 to 60, a loss ratio of nearly 4 to 1 in America's favor. In air-to-air combat specifically, the ratio was even more lopsided. American fighters destroyed over 200 Japanese aircraft in aerial combat while losing fewer than 30 of their own. McCampbell personally accounted for 34 confirmed victories during the battle, making him the Navy's leading ace of the entire war. His 9 kills on October 24th remained the Navy's single mission record. More importantly, his tactical approach, the disciplined use of altitude and speed advantages combined with precise gunnery and careful ammunition management, became the standard method taught to all Navy fighter pilots for the remainder of the war. The Hellcat itself proved to be everything American designers had hoped. Over the course of the Pacific War, Hellcats destroyed approximately 5,300 enemy aircraft, while losing only 270 in air-to-air combat, a kill ratio of 19 to 1. This wasn't luck or coincidence. It was the result of systematic engineering, rigorous pilot training, and tactical doctrine developed through bitter experience. The Hellcat represented American industrial and military power operating at peak efficiency, and Japanese forces had no effective counter. The broader implications of Leyte Gulf extended far beyond the immediate tactical results. Japan's naval defeat was so complete, so utterly one-sided, that their admirals knew further conventional naval operations were impossible. This realization directly led to the expansion of kamikaze tactics, suicide attacks being the only remaining method Japan possessed to threaten American carriers. But even kamikazes, for all their fanaticism and the horror they inflicted on individual ships, couldn't alter the war's trajectory. American production was replacing losses faster than Japan could inflict them, and American defensive tactics were becoming increasingly effective at stopping suicide attacks before they reached their targets. The invasion of Leyte proceeded according to schedule, American troops securing the island despite fierce Japanese resistance. MacArthur waded ashore through shallow water, fulfilling his famous promise to return to the Philippines. The liberation of Manila followed in February 1945. By March, American forces were landing on Okinawa, bringing the war to Japan's doorstep. And throughout these operations, American carrier task forces provided air superiority. Their Hellcats, and later Corsairs sweeping Japanese aircraft from the sky with monotonous efficiency. David McCampbell survived the war, retiring as a captain and receiving the Medal of Honor for his actions during the Battle of Leyte Gulf. He remained modest about his achievements, always emphasizing that his success resulted from good training, reliable equipment, and exceptional wingmen. Roy Rushing also survived, ending the war with 13 confirmed victories and a Distinguished Flying Cross. Both men lived long lives, McCampbell dying in 1996 at age 86, Rushing in 2012 at age 91. The lesson of Leyte Gulf wasn't that individual heroism didn't matter. McCampbell's courage and skill were undeniable. But individual heroism, operating within a system of technological superiority, superior training, and overwhelming material resources, produced results that courage alone never could. The Japanese pilots who attacked American carriers on October 24th were brave. They flew, knowing they faced terrible odds, and most died attempting their mission. But bravery, without the supporting infrastructure of modern warfare, was simply sacrifice without purpose. The Battle of Leyte Gulf demonstrated conclusively that Japan had lost the Pacific War. They'd lost it not in a single decisive moment, but gradually, through accumulated defeats that destroyed their trained pilots, sank their carriers, and exhausted their ability to replace losses. By October 1944, the outcome was mathematically certain. Japan's admirals knew it even as they committed their fleets to one final desperate gamble. The American victory at Leyte Gulf simply made the mathematics undeniable, written in the wreckage of Japanese ships scattered across hundreds of miles of Philippine waters, and in the silence of radio channels that would never again carry orders to Japanese carrier task forces that no longer existed. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.